Hello everyone, I am Sophia Angelique and welcome back to another one of my videos. So today we're going to be talking about the process of studying a photo, something that's very common in art, whether it's traditional or digital. And I apologize if I sound a little nasally in this video. Allergies are kicking my butt this month, so that's why I may sound a little weird. So basically, for some backstory, I grew up doing mostly hyperrealism, or I guess if you could even call it that, and anime art. So I have a lot of experience in both fields. These are really old, so it's honestly kind of embarrassing to show them. But just to kind of help further explain, the fact that I have been using references basically my whole life, it's something that I really value and I think is really important in the art field. So studies are good for numerous reasons. It can help you study the fundamentals or refresh your understanding of them if you've been experienced with art for a while. You can do studies no matter the style you work in. Even if you work in an extremely cartoonish style, studies can still help you practice and learn, right? And one of the biggest things it can help with is your eye-hand coordination, something I've heard a lot of artists struggle with when using references. Also, this is my cat Dinky. I was hoping he would hop on that chair there. I love him very much. You'll probably see him in the background for most of this video. But today we are studying this photo of Zhang Boheng. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I apologize if I didn't. But he is an Olympic medalist, and when I saw this photo, I immediately was like, wow, the movement of this is great, the direct lighting, I love the pose he's in, the way he's looking at the camera, and I had been working on commissions for quite some time, so I kind of wanted to take a step back and practice a bit with a study, which is something I haven't done in a while. But if you're like me, now this isn't the case all the time, but you might want to study a photo, but then think to yourself, how can I take this photo, study it, but also turn it into something that more resembles me and my art style and what I like to portray as an artist? Now, I work in a very semi-realistic style anyway. Like I said, I grew up practicing a lot of hyperrealism, so that's something that I'm pretty used to. But when I wanted to study this piece, I didn't want to copy the photo one-to-one, you know? I could have just drawn Zhang Boheng and left it at that, and that would have been completely fine. There is absolutely no problem with studying a photo and keeping it one-to-one. But I assume if you clicked on this video, you probably want to learn how you can maybe, take the likeness and essence of the photo, but tweak it a bit to make it something that's closer to your own, right? So when I first saw this photo of him, the first thing I realized was, wow, that looks a lot like Levi from Attack on Titan, right? And I realized I hadn't done a drawing of him in quite some time. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I adapt this photo and turn it into Levi Ackerman? So basically what I'm doing right now is blocking in the shapes. I am using the circle tool. That's normally how I start with a head, right? Just one clean circle, and then I build off of that. Now, one of the key things about starting with a study is remaining zoomed out. When you start a study, you want to look at the very basic essence of the photo, the very basic shapes. So that's what I'm doing right now. It's a very, very rough sketch. Now I've tilted my canvas and I've also tilted the study, and I am actively blocking in the facial features. So one of my first tips for making a study more your own is turning the person within the study into a different character. It can be any character you like. Pick your favorite character. One thing that will help is if that character's features, body structure, etc., resembles the ones in your study a bit. Because the goal of the study, of course, is to replicate the features that you see in the photo. That way, you're learning as much as you can. If you really want to challenge yourself, maybe you can pick a character that has a different hairstyle than the one in the study, right? Now, your study may come out differently than the photo that you're working with, right? But it's all part of the learning process. But I think personally, picking a character that closely resembles the person in your study helps a lot. So again, I'm blocking in very basic shapes, circles, lines, everything's pretty rough right now. The goal is to primarily get the shapes down of your study, and then you can tweak it later. And again, I'm remaining pretty zoomed out for the most part, and I'm also keeping the study fairly zoomed out and a little smaller than my artwork so that I can look at the picture as a whole instead of, you know, each little minute detail and copying it as I go, right? So with hands, a big suggestion that I have is starting with very basic shapes. So you can see here, his hands are in a bit of a different position that I'm normally used to, especially his right arm, right? His right hand, as it's braced onto the floor. Some of his fingers are coming toward the camera a bit. So I am working with very basic shapes. You can see I'm kind of blocking in those shapes right now. Now, with Levi, one thing I wanted to do in a way to challenge myself, Attack on Titan spoilers, by the way, you can skip to this part of the video if you want to skip this, but he lost his fingers near the end of the series. So you can see here, Zhang Boheng has two, you know, his pinky and ring finger braced on the floor, but Levi's pinky and ring finger are missing. So I basically made them a lot smaller, right? Cut off just before his first knuckle, or yeah, just about, or maybe just after his first knuckle. And that was a way to not only challenge myself a bit more, but tweak the original reference that I was using. Now you can see here, I'm working on his left hand, starting with very basic shapes. I'm blocking in a lot of the fingers with squares and rectangles. This is a very good example here of kind of what I mean of building the fingers up in shapes that tend to overlap so that you can understand the anatomy of fingers and how they work with each other. And here I've zoomed in on the hand of the study as well because I'm working on a part of the sketch that has more detail than the rest of it. But at this point now I have the overall sketch finished and I may make some adjustments where I see fit because this is the sketch that I want to be the most refined before I move on to coloring. As you can see here, I'm circling the arm because I wanted to I wanted to change its position a little bit. Now, one thing that can really help change aspects of your reference is if your character has something about them that you can further study that isn't a part of your original reference. In this case, it would be the scars on Levi's face. It can be scars, it can be a tattoo, it can be anything really. But if your character has something about them, you can take that and practice with that, and that's another way to separate your reference from your artwork that you've created based on the reference. Now at this point, I'm using the blocking tool to block in the first grayscale layer I will be using as a base. So here I block that in, and now I'm going in using my oil canvas brush from Yuming Lee's brush pack, and I am blocking in the first and deepest shadows that I see on the reference. Once again, we're working in big chunks. We're not doing anything too detailed. We are just taking the basic light and shadow that we see on the reference and blocking it in. So I do this throughout the entire grayscale base. I'm working in grayscale, so there's no color picking involved. I just eyeball the shadows and the light, and I try to adapt that as much as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as you're getting the basic idea of where light and shadow hits, that's enough, right? Because it can always be tweaked later. And I'm not doing anything with the background yet, because I want to primarily just focus on the shadows and light on his body so that I'm not being distracted at all by any shadows or light behind him or beneath him. Here I'm working on very basic light on his shoulders and other parts of his skin that are facing the light source, which is coming directly above him and slightly to our left, right? Because you can see there is shadow here, right? There's shadow here. If the light was coming from over here, then there would be a light source, right, reflecting off of his dark hair over here on his knuckles. But because we can see a lot of the light going across his upper body toward the left, right here, behind his arm, on his back, a lot on his face, on this cheek, we know that the light source is coming from the left over here and at the top. So here I'm working on the shadows and light on his face. I'm zooming in just a bit. And by the way, as you can see at the bottom right here, this is one layer right beneath the sketch layer. So the sketch layer is currently on top. This is kind of helps me maintain the shape of my overall sketch that I have before I start rendering over it, right? Because if I start rendering over it too early, I might lose the overall essence of my drawing too soon, and I don't want to risk that. So I'm keeping the sketch the way it is now, but it will be cleaned up later. Now I am working on the shadow beneath him, and here's where I'll start working on the background a bit, because I've decided that his body overall has been blocked in with enough rough shadow and light to start focusing on the environment. And this is very important because it inserts your subject into the scene that it's in. There's nothing wrong with having your study on a plain white or solid color background, but adding some sort of environment, even with just basic color and shadow, can help it feel a lot more real when a person looks at it. So here at this point, I'm just kind of erasing very lightly parts of the sketch that I think are very dark, parts where light hits the subject a little bit more, and I'm preparing to merge the sketch and grayscale layer. Now, one of the things that helps a lot with merging the sketch and grayscale layer is I can make adjustments to the overall anatomy or any mistakes that I see without having to adjust both the sketch and the grayscale layer separately, right? Now, you don't have to do this. You can even clean up your sketch even more before merging than I did. I'm okay with kind of having a rough sketch before I color, just because I'm used to it. I grew up primarily a traditional artist, but I like having both combined while I make adjustments because I just find it easier. I do this using the liquify tool. So you can see the little adjustments that I made. They're very slight. So at this point now, I'm making very slight adjustments on the combined layer on his face, which I want to be the focal point of the piece. I'm just fixing any little mistakes I see. Right now, it's in a pretty rough state. You'll see later I make a lot more changes, but that's okay because it doesn't need to be perfect, especially when you're at the early stages of the study. And here I'm adding some light highlights along the scars to kind of give them some more depth and that they really appear as an indent in his face, or rather a healed over indent in his face, rather than like a 2D mark that's along it, right? It helps it feel a lot more three-dimensional. Now at this point, I'm making any final changes I believe are necessary before I move on to coloring. I'm adjusting the position of his fist a bit. I'm zooming out a lot to kind of compare what I have so far to the reference. One thing that I noticed was the gap here seemed a little bit small compared to what I had. So I adjusted the size of his head. One thing that can help you notice any flaws or differences in your work compared to the study is zooming out very far, because you get a much better overall picture of your work compared to the study that you are referencing. So now I'm moving on to coloring using gradient maps. I will be making a full video breaking down the entire process of gradient maps and how I use them, so stay tuned for that. It should be coming out next week sometime. But here is my next piece of advice for how you can turn a study into more of your own piece, and that is color variation. Now, gradient maps are great for color variation. You can pretty much pick any color palette that you want using gradient maps. And as you can tell, based on the process that I am currently using, I've decided to go for a far more cool-toned piece than my study. That means I'm using a lot more blues in the highlights, because that's something that I've wanted to practice recently, having cooler tone highlights. And I'm making the warm parts of his body a lot more cool toned as well. Now, of course, there is a balance. I didn't want the entire piece to feel cool toned, meaning, you know, the shadows, highlights, everything. So what I'm doing is trying to find that middle ground by adjusting the highlights and the shadows as I go and deciding what works best. Because that's really one of the most important parts of the process is, as you go, deciding what you think looks best. You don't have to have a solid plan right from the beginning of what you want to do, what you want it to look like. That's the beauty of the process, right? Is you figure it out as you go. And it also allows for a much looser and more relaxing process. In here, I am selecting the hair so that I can select it as its own layer. I know that looks pretty funny, but I'm adding a new gradient map and making his hair much darker than the rest of his body. You can use more than one gradient map layer. That's what's so great about them. And once again, I'll be going into that in my new video this week. I also have my gradient map layers set to a clipping mask. and I'm clipping them onto the grayscale layer so that it attaches to it and doesn't bleed into the background. And now I am creating a new hard light layer, which is what I'm going to use to block in more color variation. And this is what I'm using to add peachy tones to the rest of his body. There are a lot of peach tones in the reference that I'm using, and I want to really highlight those despite the more cool toned approach that I'm going for. I still think those peachy tones can really help the piece stand out. And of course, it's flesh, right? So there's going to be a lot of peachy tones. A lot of this study has to do with skin, bounce light, how light affects skin and muscles, ridges along the body. And this study is great for that because Zhang Boheng is an Olympic medalist. So he has, as you could tell, a very defined looking body. In here, as you can see on the color wheel, I'm leaning more into the cool toned highlights that I want by picking some blue tones to add around the highlights. I'm not overdoing it too much at this point because we're still early on to the color and rendering process. Everything's just kind of blocked in. I'm getting a general idea of how I want the highlights and shadows to look. So I'm adding this recording post editing, which is why there's no face cam, because I forgot to press record earlier. But here I'm adding a lot of blue tones at the front of his chest and where his shoulder is, because one thing I really wanted to do here was enhance that bounce light that's coming from the floor. As you can see, it's not as apparent here in the reference. There is a slight hint of bounce light here in the shadows, but something you can do in your own study is take certain shadows, highlights, bounce light, whatever it is, and enhance it. Same thing that I've done with the blues here. In the highlights, I'm taking it in the bounce light in a slightly warmer color to kind of complement the floor, and I'm dragging it over the edges where he's facing the floor, and I'm really making that bounce light pop there. So now I am rendering the face. I'm using very small brush strokes varying from like 12 pixels to 19 pixels. This is where I'm adding the most detail to the piece, because in the study you can also see that the face has the most detail because the body itself is made of very large shapes, circles, triangles, stuff like that, whereas the face, especially with his scars, has a lot more line work, a lot more small curves, stuff like that. So there's going to be a lot of detail in the face rather than the rest of the body. So you can kind of see here the before and after with my process, right? I got rid of those sketch lines along the nose by rendering over them. I'm kind of just slowly dragging through this video here so you can see how I've blocked in the detail in the shapes using that same texture brush that I mentioned before. I'm really focusing a lot on those shadows, specifically along his nose, his lips, right, his eyes, because I want to create that depth. Don't be afraid to use dark shadows. There is this rule in art not to use pure black. Now that can be a good rule to follow because there is a lot of value in color variation that you can achieve without using straight black. There are a lot of deep red and blue tones in this that might not be visible at first glance, but help achieve those dark, deeper shadows that you see here, 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 and I do not need to use straight black to achieve that. However, the hair does have a lot of deep black. It helps the hair pop, it helps it stand out against the skin. He's very pale, so that dark hair really adds a nice contrast to the rest of the piece. I'm adding some more blue tones along the skin to kind of help them pop a bit more, and I'm making some of those highlights pop as well where I see them on the reference. But again, I'm going in with a blue rather than a beige that this reference has, because that's what I've chosen to do to help differentiate my piece from the study. One thing I love to do using my semi-realistic style is color outside the lines, some may say, by using textured brush strokes along the edges to not only soften them, but add a bit of interest, almost as if it's like a painterly style, right? You might notice in some oil or acrylic paintings, it has kind of rough, looser brush strokes in some of the lines. I like achieving that with my digital pieces as well because I grew up a painter, so it's kind of something that I really resonate with too. I'm rendering the neck here, really paying attention to that blue bounce light that I have along his Adam's apple, and it's not super apparent in this reference, but like I said, I'm taking some of that bounce light and I'm enhancing it to give it a more interesting look. I'm doing some more of those, oh, my cat's getting into the food. I'm doing some more of those yummy brushstroke lines along the bicep and some other parts of the skin, like you can see here. Dinky. We are nearing the finish line. I'm adding a bit more textured brush strokes. Right now I'm going into this ultra textured brush, also from Yuminglee's brush pack, and I'm kind of going over a bit to maintain some of those textured brush strokes that I like to use in my pieces, to kind of give it that painterly effect too. You can see the combination between the canvas brush, the ultra textured brush, and that other textured brush I mentioned really adds a lot of depth to the skin. Instead of having that kind of smooth glossy look, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it adds a bit more, texture to the skin overall that I really personally enjoy. So I saved the best for last, of course, being the hands. Don't be afraid of those lines. Don't be afraid of those, what some might call imperfections. If the hand is braced like this or in a position where there might be more tension, add those shapes, add those indents, add those lines. It can really help your work feel a lot more authentic rather than removing them, right? So I'm being quite careful with my lines, and I'm using a lot of hand-eye coordination here. This is really important with smaller details. I'm constantly looking over at my reference and my own work, looking at what I see on the reference and adapting it onto the canvas. Hand-eye coordination really takes practice. There's no real other piece of advice I can give other than just practice. Zooming into your reference, always keeping it on hand, whether it's on another monitor, on your phone, on the app that you're using, always keep it on hand. Constantly look from it to your work over and over again so that you can practice taking what you see and applying it to your own work. I'm being pretty careful here because since I've removed 2 of his fingers, I've taken the liberty of adding my own change to this piece. I have to use kind of my own understanding of what these fingers would look like. I did not look up any references of, healed, mutilated fingers just because I didn't really want to look at that day, you know what I mean? But I know that they'd have sort of a mangled look to them because, that skin is naturally going to heal over that wound and create a lot of that texture, those rough bumps and edges on the skin where it's healed over. So that is something that, if you're taking a part of your reference and changing it in some way, and the character or person, whatever that you've chosen to use in your study has those changes, has those aspects, whether it be scars, injuries, tattoos, anything like that, pull up another reference. It's always good to use multiple references in a piece anyway, even if you're using a study. If there's anything that you want to add to your piece, look up a reference related to that, and that way you are adapting that as accurately as possible. So I am working on that last hand here. I've zoomed into the fist on the reference. I've added kind of those lines where the veins are bulging. Again, this fist is braced down, so there's going to be a lot of tension in that wrist, in that hand. You don't have to go overboard and render every single line, but even the most simple brush strokes can help achieve that look, right? The whole concept of saying what you need to say without rendering every single little detail. That way, when you zoom out, the shapes you wanted to portray can still be seen. So now I'm pretty much just adding the last few little details. I'm adding some highlights to the scars since, if you look up scar references or scars at all, you'll see that kind of healed over scars will have a bit of a glint from where the skin had healed over. They can be a little bit shiny at times. They reflect light differently than regular skin that hasn't been wounded, right? And as I was looking at the overall piece, I decided I was going to actually add some more scars along his body. You can see I added some veins and stuff. Some of these veins weren't even in the study, but I decided to add them because I like arm veins. That's the kind of thing about studying and taking original liberties to a piece, is that you can pretty much add whatever you want. And if you're unsure of how what you're adding looks like I mentioned before, look up references. It really goes a long way. But because I'm drawing Levi Ackerman, I thought, scars along the rest of his body is probably very accurate to the original lore of his character. He's battle-ridden, he's fought, almost his entire life. So he's bound to have some scars from the battles that he's had and, the experiences that he's had. So kind of using the same process as the scars on his face, I'm going over starting with, dark shapes and going over them with highlights to get that scar effect along different parts of his body. And at this point, I have closed the reference because I'm nearing the very end, and I'm looking at my own drawing without the reference influencing me. I'm looking at what could potentially bring this drawing to the next level, right? I've added textured brushes all along his skin. I've added little moles, skin marks. That's part of my own semi-realistic style that I really like. Little imperfections along the skin that can help art feel a lot more authentic as well and three-dimensional. So I've taken little spot brushes and little textured cross-hatching brushes, and I've pretty much just added them all along his body. And that's not going to be visible in the reference because, a lot of the time you're not going to see those imperfections on a zoomed out photo. And a big part of stylized work is you're adding aspects to a drawing that do not often exist in the real world. Like you're not going to see these lines. I'm using right now a texture comb. Any hairbrush can really achieve this, or a comb brush, cross-hatching brush, whatever you have. There are a lot of free options out there as well. I really recommend looking for some free brush packs if maybe you can't afford to buy your own. But you're not going to see these on typical skin unless there is any sort of like marring on the skin that you're referencing. But this, I feel, adds a lot more interest to my semi-realistic drawings rather than, just me copying a reference one-to-one. I'm adding more texture and more interest that can maybe make my art stand out from your other realistic drawings you might see. This is, again, something that I have started doing in the last couple of years, and I really recommend kind of just practicing with your brushes, your art, adding those little textured brush strokes, seeing what works for you. That's really the biggest thing about art and developing your own style, is seeing what works for you. Look at other artists' work, not just one artist, because of course, you don't want your influence to come from just one artist, but look at, multiple different artists. What do you like about their work? What really stands out to you in their work? And just kind of develop your own style from there. Collect pieces of inspiration and study them. That really goes a long way with developing your own style and figuring out kind of what you really like. So here I am adding some last few brush strokes to his hair and a few more highlights and just kind of making it feel a lot more, real and loose. I made his hair come down with gravity a lot more than my reference, just because I think it added some more interest. He has his head down, so his hair is going to come down more. You don't have to do that, but that kind of change, I think, makes his hair look a lot more loose and free, right? And Levi's hair is, despite having the undercut, is a little bit longer than Zhang Boheng's. So here I'm zooming in pretty closely to fix any further mistakes that I see. I've brought my reference back up and I am putting it in the corner to compare and make any changes I think are necessary. His face is not one-to-one, right? Because one thing about changing your subject to a character rather than, copying the subject is some features might not look the exact same as your subject, right? If you pick a character that has a bigger nose or a hooked nose, you're gonna want to add that to your own artwork. That separates it from the study. And if you need to look up, references of hooked noses, that can help you a lot with capturing that difference. I'm adding some eyelashes, some last few little details on his face. And now at this point, I have merged everything, every single layer. That is one of my last steps, and I am taking the liquify tool and making any necessary changes I see with everything combined. That way I can work on every layer at once using the liquify tool. I brought his chin down a bit more because that was something I noticed when comparing it to the reference that I thought would be necessary, and I'm changing his lip position ever so slightly. I'm working in a size that's a bit in the middle of halfway and, the beginning of the size slider, working in small little movements. That's very important with the liquify tool, is not going too far too fast, doing too much too quickly, just working in small little adjustments. That'll help you achieve the changes that you want without feeling like you're just dragging everything all over the place too drastically, you know? So I added my signature there, and I duplicated the layer and added a blur effect over the second duplicated layer. And I set the layer to light mode. That way I get a little slight blur effect. I lowered the opacity so that it wasn't as intense. And now I'm opening the camera raw filter to make any final adjustments and add a grain effect, which is something that I always add to my artwork. As you can see, there's a slight grain effect over everything, adds another implement of texture that I really like. Now, the very last step of this is seeing how I did. I'm adding the study, the reference photo that I used, and I'm putting it over my own artwork to see how well I achieved its likeness. So I've placed the reference photo onto the canvas. I'm increasing its size. You can see the size is not 1:1, but that's totally fine. And now I am removing the layer and comparing mine to the study. I'm seeing how well I did. And you know, all things considered, I didn't do too terribly. One thing I can immediately notice is that the arm is in a slightly different position. My head is a lot smaller than his. You're not always going to get something 1:1, right? Because there's no tracing involved here. It's simply just hand-eye coordination, looking at the reference and placing it onto your canvas. I personally kind of prefer my smaller head. Not that there's anything wrong with Zheng Boheng's head, right? But I kind of prefer the way my head looks. I did at the end increase the size just a little bit. I'm still comparing, you know, obsessively. But then I'm going back into the liquify tool and making any adjustments that I see after comparing the reference to mine. And that's the thing, is even after you're all finished with your piece, you can still go back and make any adjustments that you see. And that's something that you know, really want to do after you compare yours to the study that you're using. You know, first you want to see how well you did, see what you can do better in the future, right? Maybe I will try to make his head a little bit bigger in the next study that I do. You know, here I'm doing the same thing with the hand. I'm comparing mine to his hand, noticing, okay, there are some things I didn't really get, some things that, you know, I got pretty well. I'm adding a bit more final touches. I'm adjusting the shadows on his face just a little bit on a separate layer, I might add, just so that I can add that grain effect if I make any large changes. I'm just fixing that little white spot that I saw there, making very, very small final changes using the liquify tool, comparing my changes to how it looked before. Another little added note at the end, I did end up making his head just a little bit bigger, so here is the new before and after. You can see that my head is still a bit small, but compared to the last one, which is this, you can kind of see the difference there. So I'm going to wrap up this video now. I hope you learned from it. This is kind of my first educational video, and hopefully I did okay. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I could improve on. I have a tendency to ramble, so you know, if that's something I need to work on, feel free to let me know. I'm still very new to this YouTube thing, especially commentating using my voice with the webcam and everything. So I have a long way to go, but I hope that you were able to take something from this video. And let me know if there's anything else you want to see. I'll probably be creating a rendering tutorial video as well in the future after my grayscale to color video using gradient maps. And if there's anything else you'd be interested in learning when it comes to, you know, my techniques and what I've learned regarding my own work, please let me know. But once again, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was educational, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.